For Mark Foster, an insurance adjuster who lived his life in the sterile logic of liability and fact, the world was a solvable equation. But a raging storm and a failing engine forced him off the interstate and into the flickering neon embrace of the Sleepy Hollow Motor Inn. There, he was given the last key to the last room, 312. He didn't know it yet, but he had just checked into a dead spot in reality, a place where time came undone and memory was a liability. To survive, he would have to solve the room's impossible rules before it reset him, erasing him from existence forever. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical assault. It hammered the roof of Mark's sedan with the ferocity of 1,000 tiny fists and fell in sheets so dense the wipers fought a losing battle, smearing the world into a wash of distorted headlights and abysmal black. His engine had been stuttering for the last 20 miles, a worrying cough that had finally forced him off the interstate and onto this forgotten state highway, a slick black ribbon disappearing into the maw of the storm. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on his shoulders. He was a man who measured his life in cheap coffee, wrinkled suits, and the sterile sameness of budget motels. All he wanted was a bed, any bed. That's when he saw it, a ghost of a sign flickering through the deluge, Sleepy Hollow Motor Inn. Below it, 2 words in buzzing, desperate neon blinked in and out of existence: vacancy. It was the only sign of life for what felt like 100 miles. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. The name was a little too on the nose, but the alternative was sleeping in a car that might not start in the morning. He pulled into the cracked asphalt lot, parking next to a single, rust-pocked pickup truck. The lobby was a time capsule from an era he could only vaguely recall. Dust motes danced in the weak yellow light of a single lamp. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and the faint, cloying scent of pine-scented air freshener, failing to mask decades of decay. Behind the faux wood counter stood a young man, gaunt and unnaturally still, as if he were a piece of the worn-out decor. His eyes, dark and placid, fixed on Mark as he entered. "Need a room," Mark stated, shaking water from his coat. The young man, whose name tag read Elias, gave a slow, deliberate nod. His voice, when it came, was flat and devoid of any inflection, as if he were reciting a line he'd spoken 1,000 times. "Just have the one left, end of the hall, room 312. He paused, his gaze unwavering. "The last one. Lucky you." The words hung in the dead air. There was no warmth in them, no salesmanship. Just a statement of fact. Mark, ever the pragmatist, brushed it off as the affect of a bored night clerk in the middle of nowhere. He paid in cash, the credit card machine was, predictably, on the fritz, and took the key. It wasn't a plastic card, but a heavy piece of brass with the number 312 stamped into it, attached to a large, diamond-shaped plastic fob. It felt ancient and significant in his palm. The walk down the outdoor corridor was bleak. The rain howled around the peeling paint of the railings. The door to room 312 groaned open under his push, revealing a space that was the platonic ideal of cheap motel. The carpet was a swirl of faded brown and orange, the wallpaper a floral pattern stained with watermarks and a few darker, unidentifiable splotches, was peeling near the ceiling. A bulky television sat silent on a particle board dresser. The air inside was heavy, still and thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and vaguely antiseptic. His gaze drifted around the room, his adjuster's mind cataloging the details. Worn comforter, Gideon's Bible on the nightstand, a single lamp with a scorched shade. He noticed the adjoining door to room 313. It was a cheap, hollow-core door, but a heavy-duty, rust-streaked slide bolt had been installed on his side, securing it shut. Strange. Why would you need to bolt a door that should already lock? He was too tired to care. It was just another sad room in another sad motel on another long, lonely trip. He tossed his briefcase onto the chair, stripped off his damp clothes, and collapsed on the bed. The springs protested with a metallic screech, and then there was only the sound of the rain and the rhythmic, hypnotic buzz of the neon sign outside his window. Mark Foster was asleep before he even registered the profound, unnerving silence that had settled over the room. Mark woke with a gasp, his body feeling leaden and strangely sore, as if he hadn't slept at all but had instead run a marathon. The gray light of a storm-choked morning filtered through the thin curtains. The rain had subsided to a persistent drizzle. His first thought was coffee. His second was a shower. He stumbled into the small, cramped bathroom. The fluorescent light above the mirror flickered on with a hum, casting his tired face in a sickly, pale glow. He reached for his dop kit, unzipping it to retrieve his toothbrush and travel-sized tube of toothpaste. He stopped, his hand hovering. The toothpaste tube was full, its cap sealed with the little foil circle he distinctly remembered peeling off and throwing away the night before. He frowned. He picked up his travel-size shampoo. The plastic seal under the cap, which he had broken with his thumbnail before his shower at the last motel, was perfectly intact. The bottle was completely full. A chill, colder than the tile floor, traced its way up his spine. He was meticulous. His life, his job, was noticing details others missed. He knew he had used them. He had brushed his teeth. He had stood in this very shower. He glanced at the towel rack. The towel he had used to dry his face after washing up last night, which he'd left in a damp heap on the counter, was now perfectly dry, folded into a neat, crisp rectangle on the rack. The indentation his head had made on the pillow was gone. The cheap synthetic fabric was smooth, unblemished. The bed was perfectly made. It was as if he had never been here. His logical mind scrambled for an explanation. Sleepwalking? No. Am I so tired I'm misremembering? It felt impossible. The memory of peeling the foil off the toothpaste was sharp and clear. This was wrong. This was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He had to test it. This wasn't a claim to be denied. It was an anomaly to be verified. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the room's suffocating stillness. He took a single sheet of paper from his notepad, crumpled it into a tight ball, and placed it deliberately in the center of the worn orange carpet. He then turned on the television, twisting the dial until he found a channel that was pure, roaring static. He turned the volume up just enough to be audible. He noted the time on his watch, 8:14 a.m. With a deep breath, he left the room, locking the heavy door behind him. The motel's continental breakfast was a tragic affair in the lobby. A tray of stale, plastic-wrapped pastries, a carafe of lukewarm brown water that claimed to be coffee, and Elias, the night clerk, still standing behind the counter as if he hadn't moved an inch. He watched Mark with those same vacant eyes. "Everything all right in 312?" Elias asked, his voice a monotone drown. "Just fine," Mark lied, his own voice tight. "Just grabbing some coffee." He forced down the stale pastry and bitter coffee, his eyes constantly flicking to his watch. He waited for an hour that felt like a year, the mundane horror of the lobby a strange contrast to the impossible situation in his room. At 9:15 a.m., he walked back down the corridor, his hand trembling as he inserted the key. He pushed the door open. Silence. The television was off. He looked down on the floor. The crumpled ball of paper was gone. The carpet was as bare as it had been when he first walked in. He stepped inside, his blood turning to ice. The room had reset itself. It had tidied up reality. A desperate thought seized him. My car. He scrambled out of the room and ran to the parking lot. His sedan was exactly where he had left it. The mud spatter on the doors was the same. He peered inside. A discarded coffee cup was still in the cup holder.
The world outside the door of room 312 was normal. The phenomenon, the glitch, was contained. He was in a bubble, a pocket of reality that operated on its own horrifying set of rules. He was trapped in a room that was actively trying to forget he was ever there. Panic was a live wire in his chest, but years of professional cynicism and methodical analysis were a powerful insulator. Mark Foster didn't break, he adapted. He was an adjuster. This room was a fraudulent claim on reality itself, and he was going to investigate it with the same forensic precision he'd applied to a staged car accident. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but now it was joined by a sharp, desperate intrigue. If the room reset obvious changes, what did it miss? What fell through the cracks of its strange clerical tidiness? He started with the bed. He stripped off the perfectly smooth comforter and sheets, tossing them aside. He ran his hands over the cheap, stained mattress, feeling for lumps, for anything out of place. Nothing. He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against the edge of the box spring. He pushed the mattress further, grunting with the effort. And there, wedged deep in the crevice between the mattress and the wooden frame of the box spring, was a small, flat object. It was a disposable camera. Next to it, tucked even deeper, was a small wad of folded, crumpled papers. His heart leapt. He wasn't the first. He unfolded the papers with trembling hands. It was a series of notes, written in a frantic, spidery scrawl that grew more erratic with each page. The name Miller was signed at the bottom of the first page. Private investigator. Note 1. Day 1. Arrived at Sleepy Hollow Inn investigating the disappearance of John Doe. Last known location, room 312. Standard motel. Nothing unusual, just a bad vibe. Staff, Elias is unhelpful. A walking automaton. Note 2. Day 2. Something is wrong with this room. My notes from yesterday were on the table. This morning they were back in my briefcase. The bed was made. I thought it was housekeeping, but my razor was unused. I tested it. Left a pen on the floor. It was gone an hour later. The room is resetting, tidying itself, like a localized temporal event. A glitch. Note 3. Day 3? Or is it day 2 again? The resets are becoming more frequent. The room seems to revert to a baseline state whenever I leave, or maybe when I sleep. It's a temporal sink. It erases things. Small things. Debris. Evidence of use. It's trying to keep itself clean. But what's the threshold? What's the line between a mess and a permanent fixture? The last note was barely legible, the ink smudged as if written in a panicked sweat. It's not just objects. It's trying to reset me. I woke up and couldn't remember my client's first name for a full minute. My memories, it's treating my memories as foreign data. It's trying to wipe the slate clean. I have to get out. The adjoining door, it's important. I can feel it. There's something wrong with that door. Mark felt a wave of vertigo. Miller had experienced the exact same thing. And he had disappeared. The notes were what the reset had missed, tucked away where the room's housekeeping couldn't reach. The camera. He needed to see what was on that camera. The nearest town with a 1-hour photo lab was 30 miles away. The drive was a blur of tension. He clutched the camera in his hand the entire way, terrified that if he put it down in the car, some extension of the room's influence might reset it too. He sat in the pharmacy's waiting area, jittery and paranoid, watching the clock. An hour later, a pimply teenager handed him a thin envelope. Mark tore it open in his car. The first few photos were exactly what he expected. Pictures of the empty motel room, the stained carpet, the ugly lamp, the bolted door. But then they got stranger. Pictures of the room with bizarre flares of light streaking across the frame, like long exposure shots of something moving too fast to see. Distortions in the corner of the frame as if the very geometry of the room was warped. The last 3 photos were chilling. The first was a close-up of the bolt on the adjoining door. The second was another shot of the door, but this time the image was blurry, shaken, as if Miller had been jostled. The final photo made Mark drop the envelope. It was a panicked, tilted shot of the sliver of space underneath the adjoining door. The photo was mostly a blur of carpet and shadow, but in the final frame, captured in the split second of the flash, was something. It wasn't clear. It was a patch of absolute featureless light-devouring darkness, an incomprehensible shape that seemed to suck the very light from the flash into it. It was the visual equivalent of a scream. Miller hadn't just been investigating a missing person, he had found what took him. Agent Miller's fate was a death sentence scrawled on a handful of crumpled notes. Mark was no longer just an intrigued observer. He was a prisoner on death row, and his only hope for a stay of execution was to understand the bizarre physics of his prison. Guided by Miller's descent into madness, he began a desperate series of experiments, a race to map the rules of room 312 before it finished processing him. His mind, accustomed to assessing risk and finding loopholes, went into overdrive. He needed to establish a timeline. The resets weren't constant. He'd left for an hour and it had happened. He had slept for roughly 7 hours and it had happened. Was it triggered by him leaving or by him losing consciousness? He decided to test the former. He took the Gideon's Bible from the nightstand, a native object of the room, and placed it on the floor. He then left the room, stood in the corridor for 5 minutes, and re-entered. The Bible was still on the floor. He repeated the process, extending the time. 10 minutes, 30, an hour. After he returned from a 90-minute wait, the Bible was back on the nightstand, its pages smooth, its spine perfectly aligned with the edge. So the reset wasn't instantaneous. It seemed to have a variable, but roughly hourly trigger when the room was empty. Next, he tested possessions. Miller's notes and camera had survived because they were hidden. But what about things kept on his person? He took one of Miller's less critical notes and put it in his pants pocket. He took one of his own business cards and left it on the dresser. He waited for the next reset cycle. As he expected, the business card vanished. He checked his pocket. The note was still there. Rule number 1. The room erases foreign objects left unattended. Personal effects, kept on my body, are safe. It was a small comfort, but a critical one. It meant his car keys, his wallet, his identity, for now, were safe as long as he kept them on him. His attention returned again and again to the adjoining door to room 313. It was the focal point of Miller's final, terrified note. He ran his hand over the heavy slide bolt. It was cold, colder than the ambient temperature of the room, with a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to leach the warmth from his fingertips. When he pressed his ear to the cheap wood, he heard nothing. No television, no movement, no life. Just a profound and unnerving silence, so deep it felt like it was actively absorbing sound. When he placed his palm flat against the door, a wave of dizziness and vertigo washed over him, the kind you get from standing on the edge of a great height. This door wasn't just a barrier to another room, it was a threshold to something else. Armed with this sliver of knowledge, he confronted Elias. He found the night clerk in the same spot, wiping the already clean counter with a rag. His movements were slow, economical, and endless. "I need to ask you about room 313, Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. Elias didn't look up. Out of service. For how long? Renovations, the clerk said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. It doesn't look like any work is being done. I also had a question about a previous guest, a man named Miller, a private investigator. For the first time, Elias stopped wiping and lifted his head. His eyes were empty, dark pools of placid indifference. Can't say I recall the name. People come and go. We have a lot of guests. He would have been in my room, 312. He was investigating a disappearance. Elias's face remained a perfect, unnerving mask. He said, "The rooms get cleaned. We pride ourselves on a clean room. Everything is put back where it belongs." The simple declarative statement hit Mark like a physical blow. It wasn't a denial. It was an explanation. Elias knew. He wasn't just a clerk, he was a custodian of the anomaly, a groundskeeper for a glitch in the fabric of the universe. Mark was completely, utterly on his own, locked in a battle of wits against a hotel room that was patiently waiting to clean him away too.
The room's influence was insidious. It began as a series of subtle incursions, tiny hairline fractures in the foundation of his mind.
He had dozed off in the chair for what felt like a few minutes, startled awake by a phantom noise. He stood up, stretching the crick out of his neck, and went to the sink to splash water on his face. As he looked at his reflection, a simple question surfaced in his mind. What's my mother's maiden name? For a terrifying blank second, he didn't know. His mind was a white wall. The information was simply gone. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Panic flared, hot and acidic. Then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the name, Peterson, slammed back into his consciousness. He gasped, breathing heavily, the relief so profound it left him weak. But the terror lingered. It wasn't that he'd forgotten. It was that the memory had been temporarily inaccessible, as if filed away in a locked cabinet. This was the next stage. Miller's final, frantic warning echoing in his mind. It's trying to reset me. The effect grew stronger, more pronounced. The room was no longer content with just tidying up physical objects. It had identified a new, more complex piece of foreign data to scrub. His consciousness, his memories, his personality, his very sense of self. They were all just clutter to be erased, leaving behind a clean, empty vessel. He fought back, clinging to his identity with a desperate fervor. He would pace the room, reciting facts about his life like a mantra. My name is Mark Allen Foster. I was born in Columbus, Ohio. I work for Apex Insurance. My father's name is Robert. I drive a blue sedan. But with each passing hour, with each subtle reset he endured while awake, the facts felt less like truths and more like lines he was memorizing from a script. The true horror struck when he pulled his wallet from his pocket to look at his driver's license, needing the reassurance of his own face. He stared at the small laminated photo. The man looking back at him had his eyes, his nose, his mouth, but he seemed like a stranger, a distant cousin. The connection, the innate recognition of self, was frayed. It was like looking at a picture of someone he was supposed to know intimately, but couldn't quite place. He finally understood Miller's fate. The private investigator hadn't just been physically erased. The room had worked on him slowly, methodically, like a rising tide. It had scrubbed his memories, one by one. It had tidied up his personality quirks, smoothed out his fears and his hopes, until nothing was left but a blank, compliant automaton. A man who might simply walk out of the room and forget he ever had been a person. Or worse, a man who would simply stand still until the room decided he was no longer part of its inventory at all. The stakes were now terrifyingly, existentially clear. This was no longer about escaping a weird motel. It was a race against total amnesia. He had to solve the puzzle of the adjoining door and get out before he forgot who he was, before he forgot he was in danger, before he forgot there was anything to escape from. The room was cleaning house, and Mark Foster was the last, most stubborn stain.
Desperation was a powerful tool. Mark rummaged through the trunk of his car, his movements frantic. He returned with a tire iron, a heavy piece of steel that felt solid and real in a world that was becoming increasingly flimsy. The bolt on the adjoining door was his obsession, the final variable in this horrifying equation. He wedged the tip of the tire iron into the gap between the bolt and its housing and threw his weight against it. The sound of groaning, protesting metal filled the small room. The rust-flecked steel was fused by decades of disuse and the unnatural chill that emanated from the door. He grunted, sweat beading on his forehead, his muscles screaming. He felt his own memory slipping at the edges, the name of his first pet, a fuzzy, indistinct thought he couldn't quite grasp. The fear of that loss fueled him. With a final, desperate heave, the bolt snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The old metal gave way, and the door swung inward a few inches with a low, mournful creak. He peered into the gap. The air that billowed out was freezing, a pocket of absolute cold that carried with it the smell of dust and forgotten things. The room beyond was not a normal motel room. It was pitch black, a darkness that seemed to swallow the meager light from room 312. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door fully open. He stood on the threshold, staring into the abyss. Room 313 was not empty. It was a chaotic, silent landfill of everything Room 312 had ever erased. The floor was covered in piles of detritus, a physical manifestation of the reset process. He saw crumpled pieces of paper by the thousand, half-eaten mummified TV dinners in their plastic trays, single socks, discarded toothbrushes, and half-used bars of soap. He saw luggage, a vintage leather suitcase here, a cheap nylon duffel bag there, all covered in a thick layer of gray dust. It was the room's recycle bin, its memory dump. Decades of forgotten moments all piled together in a single, silent, freezing space. In the center of the chaotic room, almost arranged like a macabre museum exhibit, was a familiar-looking leather briefcase, Agent Miller's briefcase. Next to it, laid out as if someone had simply evaporated out of them, was a rumpled suit, a shirt, and a pair of shoes. It was the investigator's final resting place. Mark stepped cautiously over the threshold, the tire iron held like a weapon. Next to the briefcase was one final, desperate note, written on a motel napkin. Mark picked it up, his blood running cold as he read Miller's last words. It's a two-way door. It erases from one side, deposits on the other. But what comes back through? The question hung in the freezing air, pregnant with a new, unimaginable horror. The door wasn't just an exit for the forgotten. It was a potential entrance. He had been so focused on what the room did to things inside it, he'd never considered what might be trying to get in. He looked around the junk-filled darkness, and for the first time, he felt he was not alone. As Mark stood frozen on the threshold between the two realities, a flicker of movement from room 312 caught his eye. He spun around. The nightstand where he'd left his wallet and car keys just moments before was now bare. A fresh wave of panic, sharp and sickening, washed over him. The room knew he had found its secret. It was accelerating the process, actively fighting back. He looked back into the oppressive darkness of room 313. There, glinting atop a pile of discarded magazines from the 1980s, were his keys, his lifeline. The room had erased them from one side and deposited them on the other, a trap. The logic of it was as perfect as it was monstrous. If he stepped fully into room 313 to retrieve his keys, the door, now freed from its bolt, might slam shut in lock, trapping him in this forgotten purgatory forever. He would become another pile of dusty clothes in the center of the room. If he stayed in room 312, the resets would continue to escalate, peeling away his memories and his identity until he was nothing more than a blank slate, another ghost haunting the Sleepy Hollow Motor Inn. He was trapped between erasure and oblivion. His mind, the mind of an insurance adjuster, raced. He dealt in systems, in assets and liabilities, in finding the flaw in the fine print. Room 312 and Room 313 were a balanced system, a closed loop. To escape, he couldn't just run. He had to break the system. He had to introduce a paradox it couldn't resolve. His eyes darted around room 312. He grabbed the Gideon's Bible from the nightstand, an object native to 312, part of its baseline state. In his pocket, he still had Miller's crumpled, frantic notes, an object foreign to 312, a piece of evidence that should have been erased but had survived, making it native to the story of the room, but not the room itself. He had to use the room's own rules against it. He stood on the threshold, planting one foot firmly in the worn carpet of 312 and the other in the dusty chaos of 313. He was a bridge between the two worlds. With a sharp, desperate motion, he hurled the Gideon's Bible deep into the darkness of room 313. He had introduced a native object into the memory dump. Then, he took Miller's crumpled, frantic notes and dropped them on the floor in the exact center of room 312, a foreign object placed where it was most vulnerable.
The effect was instantaneous and violent. A low hum began to vibrate through the floor, escalating rapidly into a deafening roar. The lights in room 312 flickered wildly, strobing between brightness and total darkness. The air around the doorway began to shimmer and warp, reality itself fraying at the seams as the room's fundamental logic crashed. The reset process was going haywire, trying to reconcile the impossible paradox he had created. It was trying to be in two states at once, trying to return the Bible to 312 while simultaneously trying to erase the notes, and the conflict was tearing it apart. This was his chance. He lunged into room 313, the freezing air burning his lungs. He snatched his keys from the pile of magazines. He didn't dare look deeper into the shadows. He threw himself backwards, scrambling out of the doorway and into the relative safety of the mundane motel corridor just as the adjoining door slammed shut behind him, with the sound like a thunderclap, a sonic boom that echoed with absolute finality.
Mark lay sprawled on the thin, grimy carpet of the motel hallway, shaking uncontrollably, his fingers wrapped so tightly around his car keys that the metal bit into his palm. The violent humming was gone. The air was still. He looked back at the doors, 312 and 313. They were identical, mundane, their peeling pane and tarnished brass numbers giving no hint of the cosmic horror they contained. He didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his knees, and ran. He didn't look back, didn't pack his things, didn't stop to formally check out. He fumbled with the locks on his sedan, threw himself into the driver's seat, and slammed the accelerator. The tires squealed on the wet asphalt as he sped out of the parking lot of the Sleepy Hollow Motor Inn, the flickering vacancy sign shrinking in his rearview mirror, until it was swallowed by the gray, indifferent morning. He drove for hours, fueled by adrenaline and terror, not stopping until the sun was high in the sky and he was 2 states away. He finally pulled into the parking lot of a bustling gas station, the noise and motion of the normal world a soothing balm. He sat in his car, trying to process what had happened. It felt like a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He tried to write it down on the back of a receipt, but the words looked insane, impossible. The story of a man fighting a malevolent hotel room. Who would ever believe him? He remembered the photos. He left the envelope on the passenger seat. He picked it up and pulled out the prints. They were fogged, indistinct. The strange light flares were gone, replaced by simple overexposure. The final, terrifying picture of the darkness under the door was now just a blurry, indecipherable mess of shadow and light. He was left with no proof. Nothing but the chilling, unprovable memory etched into his mind. Months passed. Mark was back on the road, but something in him had fundamentally changed. He avoided old, isolated motels, opting exclusively for bright, sterile, modern chained hotels. He developed a quiet phobia of leaving things behind, a compulsive need to account for all his possessions before leaving a room. The final scene of his private horror story played out on a Tuesday night in a perfectly clean, perfectly normal hotel in Des Moines. He had just unpacked his suitcase. Before heading out to grab dinner, he did his meticulous, ritualistic check: wallet, keys, phone. He glanced in the mirror above the dresser to straighten his tie. For a split second, a sliver of time so infinitesimally small he could have imagined it, his reflection was out of sync. It moved a fraction of a second after he did. He froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He blinked hard. He looked again. His reflection was normal, perfectly mimicking his every move. It was just a trick of a light, a symptom of fatigue. It had to be. But as he stared into his own eyes, a cold, creeping dread settled deep in his bones. Had he truly escaped? Or in that chaotic, reality-bending moment on the threshold had a tiny, infinitesimal piece of room 312's temporal glitchiness latched onto him, a virus in the code of his own existence. He could never be sure, and that was the most terrifying part of all. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.